It's my pleasure to be here. An outlier as an historian, uh, able and willing, well, able I hope, but willing to learn from all the things that you're talking about in rhetoric and writing, and I stole part of my title from the conference title, and I turned it into Writing Democracy on the FWP, which is the Federal Writers Project, the Perpetual Rediscovery of America. And I wanted to say something at the beginning to sort of explain the title a little bit and set the tone, and then just get into the body of what I have to say. The idea of rediscovering America was probably old when the country was young. So why is that? I mean, the Writers Project officials talked about the need to rediscover America, but they hardly were the first people to talk about that. Robert Wiebe, an historian, said some years ago that one of the permanent issues in America is that each generation passes on to the next an unfinished, incomplete answer to who really is an American and who really belongs, who can be included. And the rediscovery relates to the constant changing makeup of our society and to extending that inclusion, for those who favor that, to a broader group and to the excluded. And there'll be fight back from those who want to resist that push. So that's part of that. The Federal Writers Project was interested in the leadership, at least at the national level, the editors that guided the state guide book writing and the collection of folklores and oral history. They wanted to have a more inclusive society. They wanted something more democratic. There were limits to what they pushed on. Being a federal agency, but they went well beyond what universities at the time would have done. What I'm currently working on now is a second book on the Federal Writers Project and their experimental projects, and I want to say something about that for a minute, because I want us to think about how we think about studying the United States and how we think about ourselves as intellectuals in relationship to the country. And what's interesting to me is that there were a number of experiments that they did, many of them still unpublished, where history, literature, and folklore intersect. And they didn't worry very much about whether it was one thing or the other. They were interested in the intersection. They thought it was a more interesting way to deal with a protean, always changing culture. And they didn't have to worry about departmental boundaries. Well, they did have to worry about congressional hearings, though, as you'll see. But they didn't have to worry so much about departmental boundaries. They were free to do things they might not have been free to do in the university. And they were thinking in scholarly ways about what would be good in this regard, and given their convictions as liberal cultural nationalists, if that's not a contradiction, to push cultural nationalism not as a right-wing thing, but as something that could be used by all of us. They were thinking about what that meant to reach a public audience. And interestingly enough, they made some scholarly breakthroughs in the process, and I'm going to talk about that, things that are now recognized as scholarly breakthroughs. But most of the time, people don't think about the Federal Writers Project as having anything to do with scholarship. They think about it as these guidebooks and so on, and maybe they think positively about it, but they don't think about it much beyond that as part of American intellectual history, part of the cultural history. And in this book, in this new book that I'm working on, I want to deal somewhat with why so much has been lost. And just briefly, there are a few things. We forget how the reputation of the New Deal declined after World War II, and some of it was political, some of it was cultural politics of shame. Let's not talk about being on relief. I don't want to publish my memoirs about being on relief. The Cold War and anti-communism. In literature, the new criticism, which was made up of agrarians and partisan review people, the New York leftist magazine, and bunch of Southerners who talked about keeping things as they are, that they would become allies after World War II and concentrate on a kind of formalistic textual view of literature, really narrowed what writers could be talked about. And if you said proletarian literature, they said, well, I don't know if they literally said this, but they said oxymoron. So they just didn't discuss it. It's only recently that people like Meredith Lesueur, Jack Conroy, who was on the Writers Project, Nelson Algren, who was on the Writers Project, are getting more attention, but a bunch of other writers in the 30s. And the Writers Project was rediscovered in some ways in the late 60s and early 70s, but by young historians who wanted to use it for the new social history, which is fine. That is, let's read those slave narratives so we can write slavery from the point of view of what it was like from the slaves' experience, those interviews the Writers Project did. Let's read those interviews with southern tenant farmers. Then we can write history from, but it was not much of an interest in why were these people doing what they did? What was the intellectual and cultural context? What does it say about the fact that we haven't done it for 40 years when they start doing it? All those questions didn't interest them that very much. And that was part of the problem. But before I go much further, I want to share with you an experience I've had that was really over the several years since this book's been published, that was really kind of odd and wonderful for me. I mean, I always thought my topic was relevant. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing about it, you know? It wasn't just to meet an exercise and get a degree, although that was there. But I really did think it was important. And then one day, I began to discover that my topic is starting to become topical. That is, that it's in the papers and stuff, and people are talking about it. That's a little different than just relevant. Relevant, I have to convince you that it's relevant. And not everything that is relevant becomes topical. For example, we've not heard much about rural poverty. Despite the talk you gave this morning, that's not headlines in the papers, right? Unemployment rates in some of our big cities and certain sections of them. The deindustrialization of the city, which really goes back to the 1950s, doesn't become a major issue until deindustrialization spreads to the suburbs. But anyway, it was becoming topical. So I get a phone call and an email from Spark Media saying about 2006 or 7, they want to make a documentary film about the Writers Project, and would I be on their advisory board? Well, yeah. I mean, really? That's great, you know. And then after Obama was elected, I am reading the New York Times, and I start seeing stories about people thinking about a Writers Project again. Didn't happen. But nevertheless, it's pretty interesting. And then I come here, and people are discussing how to build bridges and write about different. I really didn't know about much about. I had friends who teach comp, and I'm open to learning a lot. I bought a couple books, and I really do want to learn more. It's part of my continuing education. It's been great. But there were some headlines, and some of them were optimistic in 2009 after Obama had been elected. But I have a mix of them, some of them from 2009 and some of them from the 1930s. And I'm just curious which one you think is which. For example, the challenge for culture boosters in the Congress was to convince a House Senate Conference Committee that the arts provide jobs as other industries do, while also encouraging tourism and spending in general. Was that in the 1930s or was that in 2009? 2009, actually. It was an article in the New York Times. But it sounds like it could be just out of the same argument as the 30s, even in talking about tourism, because you have to remember that the major product of the Federal Writers Project was state guides, okay? And so I'm noticing these articles. I mean, even Newsweek quoted me. My mother thinks I'm famous now. You know how mothers are. And I found it just fascinating to keep up with this stuff. And there were a number of these kinds of quotations. It's a great opportunity for the cultural workforce to be dignified as part of the American workforce. The 1930s or 2009? Again, 2009, Patrice Walker, the head of NEH. But you're right. I mean, my point is that it could just as easily be one or the other. Who said, hell, they've got to eat just like other people about writers and artists? And when? When? 30s. Harry Hopkins, who was the head of became the head of the WPA. How about this one? Are you suggesting that if you work in the arts, it isn't real when you lose your job? Huh? Congressman Obey, a great man, in my opinion. There's not much of I'm not going to give any much rhetorical arguments for that. I just asserted that. And left it at that. I'm going home with a new vocabulary. So you have a number of these. This one, let's see if you get this one, though. In every one of those books, I have noticed propaganda for the labor movement against capital and towards stirring up hatred between the classes. 30s. But you're right. And later it became the Martin Dies was the first. The UAC existed. It was born in the 1930s, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and Martin Dies was the first head. I mean, the Red Scare of McCarthy is not the first Red Scare. The first Red Scare is after World War I. The Dies starts in the 30s. Unfortunately for him, fortunately for as my point of view, he didn't anticipate we would be an ally of the Soviet Union during the war. And the House Un-American Activities Committee was initially created, some of the legislation was put forward by a congressman from New York named Morris, no, that's not right. His last name was, I think, Dickstein, and Senator Eastland from Mississippi said, well, this senator from New York had come here when he was 3 years old. He said, if we're going to have a House Un-American Activities Committee, and he wanted it to, the New Yorker wanted it to investigate Nazis, communists, fascism, and so on. Eastland said, don't you think we should have somebody who was born in America the head of it? The guy had come here when he was 3 years old. It tells you something about some of the divisions between what was considered immigrants, even though he had been a citizen probably from about the time he had been 5. So Dies becomes the head of it. And so you have all of that going on in the 30s. And so what seems maybe, well, the Federal Writers Project stressed cultural diversity and inclusiveness, you know, blah, blah, blah. We all want to do that now. It isn't conservative in the 1930s. Does everybody follow me? And it doesn't have to be conservative now if we take it beyond just, what was the word you used? Wooden, right. If we don't do that, if we really mean it and we really think about it, how much do Americans, I mean, when the majority of white Americans think about immigration, they think about Hispanics, right? Have they not been I mean, you can't get a cab in Chicago without having a great conversation with somebody from some other part of the world. I mean, so there's a lot still to be learned that people don't have much information about and much beyond imagery. The, going into this, I wanted to tell you something about, that I think will tell you something about the Writers Project by talking about my journey coming to this, actually. And I think that can be useful. And this conference sort of is the last part, the most recent part of it. Now, hopefully not the last part. And what we think about the role of academics as public intellectuals. Something much more difficult to do in our day. And you know, Russell Jacoby, who's written a book about the decline of the public intellectuals some years ago, said that after World War II, the Bohemians moved from the cafes of Bohemia, the intellectuals moved from the cafes of Bohemia to the cafeterias of the university, which I wish I could take credit for that turn of phrase, but with some gains, but with a lot of losses as well. But it became an economic necessity. You couldn't, I mean, how many book review pages are there anymore in newspapers? The only show, aside from C-SPAN, does anybody know what the only commercial TV show is that does sometimes book reviews? This will surprise you. No? Well, that's true. How about in the evening? Stewart and Colbert, they interview authors of new books and mention them, but that's about it. When I first got to graduate school, many, many moons ago, I had a lot of misconceptions. I thought everybody was going to be brilliant. That disappointed me for a while. I found out all the graduate students weren't brilliant and all the professors weren't brilliant. But then, how am I going to keep up, you know? But being somewhat competitive, fear is also a form of being competitive. And so I thought, I'm taking George Tyndall's seminar on Southern history. I had gotten there a few weeks early. I'll go into the library and see what he's got on reserve for that seminar and start reading, because everybody's going to be so much smarter and better informed than I am. And I picked up a book. So help me, this really happened. It was called These Are Our Lives. It was a collection of interviews done with Southern tenant farmers, former slaves, textile mill workers. But the full title of the book is These Are Our Lives as Told by the People and Written by the Members of the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. I read that several times because, I had never heard of any Federal Writers Project, and I didn't know that stories as told by the people was history. I'm not arguing. I made a conversion a long time ago, but that was the nature of it. You know, here were these writers doing history, and it was literature, and it was about the South, which I was interested in at that time. And so I eventually got to the point where I wanted to write a book about the Federal Writers Project. In the meantime, I ended up co-editing as I went through the papers of the Federal Writers Project in the Southeast. We found that there were a number of life histories that they had done interviews or early versions of oral history that had not been published. And Tom Terrell and I went through and published a book called Such As Us, Southern Voices of the 30s. Such As Us comes from one of the interviews in which the narrator says, "Do you think folks want to read about Such As Us?" She just can't understand why anybody would interview her because, in her view, she's not part of history. And of course, they thought otherwise, and so did we. And I began to discover that all these things were going on, and what's been written about this Federal Writers Project. The books that I picked up, they all seem to be bureaucratic histories. When did it start? How many people were on it? And so on and so forth. And with a few words thrown in from quotations from the time about people who said the guidebooks were great. And I thought, why are they writing guidebooks? Why did they choose that? Why did they choose some people to interview and not others, okay? Why did they choose interview projects? Why were they interested in orality and locution and folklore? The problem with the word folklore is the word folk. But I think with the word lore, we're on, it's less of a problem, but oral tradition. And I decided I was going to write a dissertation about this, and that was the topic I was going to pursue. And I did have a few people, both graduate students and professors, not my major professor, but said, but there's been books written about the Federal Writers Project. Why are you doing that? You should be doing something that nobody's done. I said, nobody's done what I'm looking for. And so that's what I was going to do. One of the interesting things that happened out of that, and happened out of that was that I got a job at one point with something called the Tennessee Community Heritage Project, which was a 3-year experiment in public history, reaching out to communities and helping them do local histories, and getting them involved in doing the research and the writing and so on. And one of the reasons I got hired for that was they thought, because I had co-edited Such As Us and was writing about the Federal Writers Project, I must know all about oral history. I had not had a course in oral history in graduate school, although there was a new oral history program. I had not had a course in public history. And what it did was, it went back and forth. Paying attention to what's going on in the present in oral history and public history gave me new ways of thinking about what I was writing about. But what I was writing about and eventually turned into a book, gave me new ways of thinking about what I see developing out there. So there we are. And I had begun to think about this issue of public space before I did come to this conference, but I was happy to hear a lot about Habermas, since I haven't read that much of Habermas, and I knew about him, but I need to read a little more. But right now I'm cribbing a little, so that's, but you know, the guidebooks, if you think about it, a travel guidebook, that's middle-class public space by definition, right? But can you bring other voices into that? And that's one of the things that the Federal Writers Project did try to do. And so in the last stage in all of this, of course, the most recent is listening to the papers here and listening to the speakers. But I also, right before I came here, there was the Texas research stage, in which I want to share with you because I think some of you will appreciate it from a local perspective. But it's also relevant to the General Writers Project. Benjamin A. Botkin, B.A. Botkin, became the second folklore editor of the project in 1938 and was responsible for most of these experimental programs. But in 1937, he still considered himself a regionalist. The regional movement of the interwar years, he considered himself a Southwestern regionalist. He was an interesting Southwestern regionalist because he had been born in Boston and had taken a job at the University of Oklahoma. He was one of the few people who thought about literature and folklore and history who had both a urban immigrant background, children of immigrants, and was familiar with rural America. Anyway, he wrote Henry Smith, who later became Henry Nash Smith. But Henry, the author of Virgin Land, one of the classics in American studies, he was then the editor of the Southwest Review. He wrote him and said, we should have a conference of Southwestern writers in Dallas at SMU. And many of the people he mentions are not particularly radical, like Anil Long, who was from New Mexico. He mentions Lynn Riggs, who became famous later for Where the Lilacs Grow, which became Oklahoma. But here is Botkin's ideas about what the conference should be. And it's the local, the national, and the international in his view. He says the aims of the Southwest Writers Congress: to bring Southwest writers into association with each other for the first time, to create a regional consciousness on the basis of present-day social, economic, and cultural realities, okay? To discuss the relations of the Southwest writer to his region, the nation, and the world, and his functions therein. to estimate cultural progress, to put culture at the service of all society, and to defend culture against the repressive measures of antisocial and anti-democratic forces of the region, nation, and world, to collaborate with other regional, national, and world conferences devoted to similar aims. This I probably would have eventually seen in the Botkin papers, but there's a letter from Smith to a friend of his that I wouldn't have seen, to a man named Priest. And he says in here, he says, Botkin had written me somewhat vaguely about the proposed conference. And I had replied that I would probably be interested. Then to skip some, he says, as you know, SMU is not likely to want to sponsor a conference that will rock the boat too much. And I am sure the authorities would desire full particulars of plans and personnel before they could decide whether or not it would be appropriate for the meeting to take place here. Botkin was clearly moving in the direction of what was called the Popular Front. No enemies to the left, anti-fascism. He was a member, he spoke at the American Writers' Congress, defending regionalism, saying it didn't have to be conservative nostalgia for pastoral areas. It could be about conflict, and it should be, and it needs to be dealt with. And I think one of the first sentences in his opening paragraph was that regionalism suffers from its association with lost causes, which was a reference to the Southern agrarians. The Writers' Project was dealing with persistent questions that often get labeled rediscovery about who and what was American. And when you think about it, it is not, there's a tendency to feel like it's a brand new question. Why has the country changed so much or whatever? It was a question that Emerson and Whitman were asking in the 19th century and asking in pluralistic ways. Ben Botkin underlines in his his college volume of poetry the most pluralistic passages in Whitman, the ones that talk, and he also underlines things in Emerson like we should no longer live off the sere remains of foreign harvests. But in the 20th century, people like Randolph Bourne, who talked about transcultural America before World War I. Some of you may know that Bourne was or not, because everybody gets forgotten in America. It's the most popular title in the world, Forgotten American, you know. But Bourne wrote a famous essay called Transnational America, arguing that immigration was a good thing and it would make the country more cosmopolitan, et cetera, and we were the country to do that, and so on. He also wrote an essay opposing World War I called War is the Health of the State, which is a really memorable title, I think. But it wasn't as if everybody in the 1930s was supporting this. They had real enemies. Remember that this is in some ways a pushback against things that have been developing since the end of Reconstruction and since the old new immigration, what they called the new immigration, which was mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. For example, if I say to you, I do this to my students, if I say to you, what words, descriptive words or images come to mind when I say the 1920s, what's the first thing you would think of? Or what's the first thing my students would think of? You'd all be more sophisticated. But what do you think they first say when you say the 1920s? Huh? Flappers, roaring 20s, and so on. But what if I mention to you, I say to them, well, what about the Ku Klux Klan? The Ku Klux Klan? Yeah, there was a revived Klan in the 1920s that was nationwide and was all about the real American is white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. The Al Smith presidential election, Smith and Hoover in 1928, the anti-Catholic themes, Hoover was the first Catholic nominated to run for president. The immigration laws right after World War I, which were not meant simply to lower immigration numbers. If you wanted to do that, they could have made a much less complicated law. They said, let's go back to the census of 1900 and see what percentage people of English descent in the population are, and say people of Polish descent, and people of Italian descent. So, okay, we'll have 12,000 immigrants next year that we'll allow. The Polish get 1% of those. If they don't show up, it just goes to waste, so to speak. They wanted to recreate what the country was like before the new immigration. Then they decided that law wasn't good enough in Congress. They decided to go back to the 1890 census because that would be even better from the point of view of creating the real America. So all of this is part of the inheritance going into the 1930s, this conflict over who and what is American. In any case, the Writers' Project did have its enemies, and in 1936, Alf Landon, when he ran for president, disdainfully said, "This administration has found time to make guidebooks." How well did that turn out for Alf Landon? In 1936, Roosevelt carried 48 states. He lost only Maine and Vermont. And the saying had been up to that time, as goes Maine and Vermont, so goes the nation. And it became, as goes Vermont, so goes Maine. In any case, the Writers' Project responded, and it's interesting because there's a dance here that they have to do, trying to justify the existence of the project, because Congress did not pass it because they wanted to sponsor cultural renew and new definitions of Americans. They were willing to pass it and let it go under the WPA because they wanted to create jobs. So they said, well, hey, railroad and steamship lines and chambers of commerce and hotel associations and automobile clubs are all in favor of these guidebooks. It'll help recovery. And furthermore, we're writing really good guidebooks. They're encyclopedic, they're cultural, and so on. And so they try to balance that. We're rediscovering America, they said. We're introducing America to Americans, which is an interesting notion. In other words, you don't really know your country. And if you stop and think about it for a minute, almost all of us would find out that there are many aspects of life in America that we don't know much about. I don't think I realized until I was reading the New England guidebooks, it would have made sense to me if I thought about it, that there were a lot of people of French descent who were Franco-Americans living in those New England states. Do you see what I mean? There's a lot of this. The project was created in 1935. Interestingly enough, at the same time that there had been a call for the Popular Front, the Communist Party decided it wouldn't oppose Roosevelt any longer. I mean, their attitude had initially been the attitude of a lot of my radical friends towards the Obama administration. What's Roosevelt done? He had a chance to nationalize the banks and he didn't do it. He's creating shortages through the Agricultural Adjustment Act and using the marketplace and so on. But then they changed their minds with the rise of fascism and followed a difference abroad and and the growth of unions at home and followed a different strategy. And so it became part of the New Deal Arts projects developed in this atmosphere. And it was an unprecedented government endeavor, but it was tied to work relief. It was not primarily a patronage program for artists and writers, especially not the Writers' Project. That is, almost the first, if you mention the Writers' Project, people say usually, what famous writers were on it? And I could reel off some names, I probably will in a minute, but that wasn't the point. The point was to create this new picture of America. Does everybody follow me? And but on the project at different times were people like Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, John Cheever. I don't think it really did much for Saul Bellow at all because he said he had the most boring job about writing about the zoo in Chicago, but who knows. Nelson Algren, Jack Conroy, who are a little less famous, but who were certainly leftist writers in the 30s. Mostly it was work relief for, oh gosh, that word that we don't know how to define, literate people, literate middle-class people, people who had a linguistic, what did you call it again, a rich linguistic, deep linguistic Yeah, that. And you had middle-class teachers who were out of work on it, you had lawyers, you had journalists, you had librarians. They were required to take 90% of their workers from the relief roles. Much of the actual writing was done by the small 10% that was left. I mean, I'm not saying there weren't other people who did good jobs, and the 10% who were left were not wealthy. They just didn't qualify for relief according to the definitions. These were people who also desperately needed a job. And there was a kind of state and local and national continuum. That is, you had a federal office, which I've mostly focused on what they were trying to do. I've seen some of the limitations at the state and local level. But people at the state level often had a different agenda from the liberal leftist office in Washington. And at the local level, still different agendas, like, do you know that we have the biggest this? Forget about all the biggest, and anything that ends in S, they told them to leave out. But also, such and such is worth talking about, according to us in our and the us was usually middle-class people who were unemployed. So you can't leave it out. We want it included. No, that's really not all that worthwhile. But we would like you to write more about the black community in your area. They got back the response, what is there to say? And they hired Sterling Brown, a black poet, to be the Negro Affairs editor, and he had to deal with a lot of these conflicts. In fact, one of the funny in a bitter sense was in South Carolina, the head of the State Writers Project wrote a letter to Henry Ellsberg, the national director, who kept this whole thing going through Vision because his sort of nickname among other writers was the Colossus of Chaos. But she wrote him that if we have to put in stuff about the black community that we wouldn't put in about the white community, it will offend all kinds of people in South Carolina. And he wrote back and said, we're not asking you to put in stuff, extra stuff, we're just asking that you be representative. And the same exchange took place with Sterling Brown. And so here you find this local national continuum. She wrote, the director, she wrote Sterling Brown, the stuff that you want us to put in doesn't belong in a travel book and will offend the best people in South Carolina, and so on and so forth. And we've been relying on the advice of, I can't remember her name right now, and she went to Smith College, up north. And she's very cosmopolitan. She's been all over South Carolina. Brown had to be fierce and diplomatic at the same time. And he wrote back, we are aiming for more than just tourist books, although that is an aspect of it. And then he proceeded to quote, he said, it is not biased to rely on the research of the best white Southern sociologists, and then quoted them at length, people like Howard Odom and at University of North Carolina. But this kind of thing went on constantly. And so there was this intermingling of the immediate practical goals of providing work relief and trying to get some more long-lasting contribution to American culture done, to redefine it by embracing the country's very diversity, to rediscover America. One of the project leaders said, to give us a new and broader knowledge of the country we live in. And I have added to that using that quote, and not to see it in the narrow, exclusive terms of the dominant culture. At its height, there were about 6,000 workers on the project between 1935 and 1939. And then between 1939 and 1942, it became the Writers' Program. Defense spending, or preparation for war, is what ended the Depression, but, as I have to point out to my students, so they go, war ended it, so they should have started a war sooner, I guess. And I said, what if they had spent the money earlier, the same amount of money on domestic things? Would that have had the same impact? I go, yeah, would have at that time. So, but defense spending, nobody complained about the balanced budget at that point, you know. It's defense. And as the Writers' Project wound down and there was more employment, its enemies came out of the woodwork more. Martin Dies of the House Un-American Activities Committee said that they were stirring up racial conflict by dwelling on these issues, by referring to black Americans as deprived of rights. I thought that was a kind of neutral, factual statement, you know. But it isn't in the context that he lives in, because in his context, the less it's talked about, the better off he and those who agree with him are. So if you talk about it, you're stirring up trouble. The Congress began to cut back on the arts projects. It totally abolished the theater project, which was much more visible, but it allowed the Writers' Project in a minor way to continue until eventually the war brought it to an end. The project directors, not to talk about how do you portray America and how do you do it in a guidebook, that's part of it. They were interested in the ordinary, the daily, the local, the same kind of language I saw in some of the brochures about this conference. It's absolutely, you could have stolen it from me, from the Writers' Project, or I could have stolen it from the conference thing. It's the same language being talked about making place meaningful. But the control of it was not as open-ended as it might be. And that is the number of people who had real input. Nevertheless, it was a development, a push in the direction of a more positive, open view of who is an American, and the idea that you may not know your country if you haven't thought about this, and that you need to be introduced. We were introducing Americans to America, or America to Americans. The second phase really begins when Ben Botkin joins the Writers' Project as the national folklore editor, and they already been doing some of this, but he pushes the idea of oral history interviews. He's interested in industrial workers, ethnic minorities, and they've been doing some of the former slave narratives, the former slave interviews. But if you think about this, this is opening up what would be huge historical questions, because the end of Reconstruction was meant to be closure on the issue of African Americans in American society. That is, okay, they're no longer slaves. We officially say in our Constitution that they're citizens with the same rights as others, but we let white Southerners have home rule in practice. The Republicans more or less run the country. Democrats are located in the South, and the racial issue is supposed to stay closed. Some things that reopened that are the continuing struggle of Black Americans and their fight for rights, and some of their white allies, and the role of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, but also the Black migration. It was never just a regional issue if you believe in democracy and rights. But in practical daily life, you could treat it as a regional issue before the Great Migration, which begins about 1910 and doesn't end, and accelerates after World War I. So that cities like Chicago, New York, Milwaukee, Cleveland begin to have huge Black populations, large percentages, along with these new immigrants. It's no longer possible to ignore it. Up until the 1936 election, in the North where they could vote, they mostly voted Republican. What is their memory of Democrats? It's Southern Democrats who say, in South Carolina, it's on the Democratic symbol, the party of white supremacy. But in 1936, they begin to switch heavily to Roosevelt for a number of reasons. So this question of what is the place of African Americans in this society. Not an issue that the Roosevelt administration is pushing on the rights issue. You couldn't get an anti-lynching bill supported by Roosevelt because he said, and this is the way in which, if you think the Civil War ended with just the military phase, you're mistaken. It was the military phase that the North won, and the political phase, Reconstruction, which the North gave up on. So that in a one-party section, people were elected over and over again and controlled committees through seniority. And Roosevelt said, he told Mary Bethune, I want to support the anti-lynching bill. It's absolutely right. But if I do that, they'll tie up every bit of legislation that would help all Americans in committee forever. We will get there, but it will be a long and hard road. So in practical terms, he did not push rights issues. They did push cultural and practical issues. That is, they announced, for the first time, there were many members of the blacks in the federal government and the administration as advisors. The guidebooks were a cultural component of the writers of the New Deal coalition in some ways. And it's a cultural issue as well, and a big historical issue. What do we make of these new immigrants? Matthew Jacobson recently said, until after World War II, the title of his book is Whiteness of a Different Color. Poles, Italians, Southern and Eastern Europeans, and the Irish who get classified with the Southern and Eastern Europeans, don't become white until after the Second World War in a real sense. So these are complicated historical issues that the professional historians are not pursuing that much. U.B. Phillips, who was the noted white historian of slavery from Georgia, said that he could only write from primary sources, but all memoirs were to be disregarded because they're colored by the passage of time. So he wrote a history of slavery that's a great history of planters. The voice of ex-slaves and the experience of slaves is completely missing. So the idea of interviewing slaves about what the slave experience was like was something that needed to be done, but that historians hadn't thought about. And they weren't used much for another 40 years. And they began collecting lore in all of its ethnic, work-related, regional dimensions all over the country, and not privileging one kind over another, not privileging the rural over the urban, the old over the new. They saw it emerging in the present, not just as a survival from the past, so that if you had in Oklahoma folk cures, which would be worth writing down because it's interesting, but they are a dying tradition. But the language of taxi drivers, this modern technology, they are developing a language that is a kind of lore and locution of their own that would be worth writing down. And Ben Botkin thought it would stimulate, it would be worthwhile in itself, but it would also stimulate a new kind of literature. That is, he thought that both high modernism was too remote, too narrow. He admired much of it, but in what it covered, that maybe some of the proletarian literature was too formulaic because it was interested in its outcome. He said, let's get back in touch with the language of ordinary people. And he was interested also in what you would call, and he actually used the term in the 30s, but what we would call today hybridity. Instead of looking for the pure, untouched, real thing, he'd say, what happens when two cultures mix? Let's study that. And let's see what's going on. And in fact, what happens when high culture borrows from popular culture or borrows from folk culture, or folk culture borrows from popular culture, and that it's all, there's a two-way flow. We would say it's probably more complicated than that, but nevertheless, it's a new way of looking at it. And they moved on from this to do all of these kinds of experimental things, some of which have been published. The American Memory Project, if you want to check it out, the Library of Congress has put a lot of these interviews online now. Now, a lot of these interviews, by oral history standards of interviewing today, would be deeply flawed. On the other hand, nobody else was doing them, and they were path-breaking. In 1938, the historian Alan Nevins, who's sometimes seen as the founder of oral history, who taught at Columbia, called for doing oral history, and the Columbia program began after World War II. But here's the interesting thing. The National Office of the Federal Writers Project is talking about interviewing former slaves, textile workers, steel workers, and so on. Okay. Nevins wants to interview the elites because he said, with the telephone and the telegraph and the railroad, we're not going to be able to write history anymore because these people call each other and they talk to each other and they go to meetings together over the railroad. So he wanted to go on writing the history of the movers and shakers. And it was going to become harder and harder in his view because they weren't going to be leaving letters and so on. The Federal Writers Project wanted to write the history of new emerging groups that had been created out of conflict, the Civil War, the end of slavery, and what should that mean, out of modern industrialization. And these people haven't been studied, and they're part of history as well. And Nevins and the Federal Writers Project both realized something that a lot of historians are only beginning to remind themselves in this post-linguistic turn. Nevins, old-fashioned as he was, and a great historian in some ways, he said, well, we have to have a national history because history is how you create a narrative that welds people together into unity. The Federal Writers Project seems to be saying, yes, history and literature are how you create a narrative that might weld people together. And we need to include a lot of people in that narrative that we haven't included, okay? And so they left us a lot of inherited questions. That is, questions that they inherited and tried to answer, and that we still need to deal with, and that using their work gives us some perspective on. I just want to close with one example of a piece that has been published. There was a man in New York City, a fish peddler, black fish peddler, who went by the name of Clyde Kingfish Smith. The street cries of Clyde Kingfish Smith were recorded by Herbert Halpert and Marion Hatch for the FWP, not with tape recorders, but written down. Smith said that he varied his cries to fit the ethnic neighborhood in which he was working. He used his own tunes, but he also sent his fishmongering lyrics to popular tunes. He interspersed a Yiddish phrase from a popular song in the middle of his own cries. There was a song at the time called By Mir Mr. Shane, which was a Yiddish song that they took one line from, and then the rest of it was in English. But he took the line, and he came up, his street call became, By Mir Mr. Shane, I got big brother fish again. By Mir Mr. Shane, I think they're grand. I could say bello, bello, and even voom diva. That would only tell you how grand they are. By Mir Mr. Shane, I got flounders again. By Mir Mr. Shane, I know they're grand. He observed, Smith, that this goes over good in either Jewish or colored neighborhoods, but I have to swing it up a bit more in the colored neighborhoods. Smith was extraordinarily attuned to the ethnic diversity of his audience. He varied his approach to fit that audience. He offered a definition of what he did that folklorists could easily add to their numerous attempts to define folklore. These songs are not written down. I sing them different. I put words to the tune to fit the occasion, to fit the neighborhood. Halpert and Hatchett collected a piece of urban lore, and that doesn't sound strange to us, but there would have been a lot of people who said there was no such thing at the time. And in fact, folklorists in the people who did study locution and orality and these kind of things at that time were mostly folklorists, but the folklorists who studied literature were in English departments and focused on English ballads. And the people who studied, the anthropologists who would have studied this kind of thing, were mostly in anthropology departments, but focused on Native Americans. So getting creative writers to do it was an innovation on Botkin's part that he thought would have positive impact for the culture in general. He said, when I first come to the block, nobody pays any attention. Then I start singing, get them to laughing and looking, and soon they start buying. A lot of them just hang around to hear the song. I would say he was a folk artist with a repertoire, a technique, and a temperament. The main idea is when I get something I want to put over, I just find something to rhyme it with. And the main requirement from that is mood. You got to put yourself in it. You got to be in the mood. You got to feel it. It's got to be more an expression than a routine. Out of different urban cultural fragments, Smith had come up with what he called my individual cry, something people wanted to hear, a cry that embodied a creative reciprocity between the diverse urban folk groups and an individual voice. And then by way of contrast, to think about high modernism, see if you can follow this. Clyde Kingfish Smith, unlike T.S. Eliot's Fish or King in The Wasteland, wandering through modern wastelands, Clyde found a way to work and create in an urban industrial environment. A lot of the pathos of The Wasteland is that Eliot doesn't think the fragments can ever come together. It's terrible. There's all these new groups and so on and so forth. Clyde Smith, in a small but pleasing way, gave aesthetic form to materials drawn from the modern city's diversity, what Eliot and others, other high modernists on the right, saw only as cultural fragments. So the Writers' Project is ended, but maybe it's not dead. Who does that depend on? Us, right? Thank you.